Hey, welcome back, everyone. As you start to make your way back, it's my pleasure to introduce Timiro Mohamed. Timiro has been working with Omer and the Islamic family in Alberta in Edmonton, yeah, on a range of sessions over this past Ramadan about Muslim Indigenous engagement. Is a really prolific poet, and I'm so pleased to have Timiro hosting us for the next 50 minutes or so. Welcome, Timiro.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here among, so many amazing sessions and speakers. My name is Timiro, and I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation Region 4, which is the traditional gathering place of Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Iroquois communities. Today's session, the intention is to sort of create a space where through discussion and creative expression and storytelling, we can begin to unpack land and settlement and displacement, and also draw on personal narratives and Muslim traditions to do our best to just begin to learn with one another. I am also a student, and I'm also someone who's trying to learn and unpack all of these notions along with you. So I'm really just here to facilitate conversation. So the intention for today is that we're going to look to art and poetry in particular, because as a poet, I'm a little bit biased. And those are going to be sort of the prompts that guide us through the conversations. Before we begin, I'm going to share with you this activity guide. I don't have a PowerPoint. The hope is that we can just sort of talk and discuss. Please don't be intimidated. There's a lot of text because it has all of the prompts and the works that are inspiring us. This is sort of just meant to be a resource that you can revisit later on if you feel like you just want to reflect on what happened today, because I'm going to pack in a lot of information in a short amount of time. So if it looks long, don't be scared. All right, so that's in the chat. So inshallah, it's available to you at any time that you want to access it. So before we jump into trying to do some storytelling, I just want to talk a little bit about what responsible storytelling can look like, because I think that's a really important guiding point and a grounding point as we enter this conversation. So first off, I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable today. You don't have to share that, but just at least in your own writing and in your own reflections. And as you do that, it's really important to consider that when we are being vulnerable, and we're being vulnerable about things that are traumatic or that we're healing from, it's really important to consider if you're ready or prepared to approach or discuss that story. That's the first thing. And the second is it's really important to consider our place as we enter conversations, especially when we're talking about decolonizing. So thinking about our privilege, thinking about if we're advocating as an ally, what stories are ours, what stories are appropriated, and what position do we occupy when we're speaking or sharing stories. Okay, so we're going to jump in. The first sort of theme that we're going to talk about is displacement. And the way that we're going to do that is I've prepared 3 poems from Muslim and Indigenous writers. And I feel like there's a lot of where the thoughts or the feelings or the memories that this poem brings up for you. And you can raise your hand or you can share in the chat. And there's no wrong answer. Okay, for me, I can share first. For me, Waterston Shidda's poetry is really sort of important for me because it was one of the first times that I saw stories about home and displacement that felt familiar being reflected in writing. And I think it's really important for me to begin with this poem because anytime I'm talking about settlement or colonization, I do so within a context of my personal experiences and my personal history. And so that's why I think it's interesting to be able to sort of draw parallels between very different stories that are also familiar and similar in their own ways. Okay, The next poem is titled Ode to Northern Alberta. This is a poem by Billy Ray Belcourt, who is a Cree writer and poet based here in Edmonton. Before I move on, I'm going to read a comment from the chat reflecting on Home by Watson. So Noor writes, it resonates with my experiences as a refugee, a status which itself is a direct colonial legacy. Ambivalent relationships with home. Yeah, beautiful. Same. Okay, here's Ode to Northern Alberta. Here, no one is birthed, only pieced together. I tire myself out pretending to have a body. Everyone worships feelings they don't have names for, but no one is talking about. Love is a burning home we built from scratch. Love keeps us busy while the smoke clears. History lays itself bare at the side of the road, but no one is looking. History screams into the night, but it sounds too much like the wind. Cree girls gather in the bush and wait for the future. In the meantime, they fall in love with the trees and hear everything. In the 1950s, my not yet Mushum ran away from a residential school in Joussard, Alberta. As an adult, he kept coming back, despite knowing heaven is nowhere near here. Same question. What are the initial thoughts, feelings, memories, experiences that the poem brings up for you? And again, you can raise your hand or you can share it in the chat. And I'll continue to the final one. This is excerpts from Mama's Land by Ifrah Hussein. Ifrah is a Somali poet based in Ontario. There are some Somali words, but I translated them in the footnotes. Perhaps this world is an abyss that swallows us like a sunken hole or a soluble rock that envelops the tears of our women and regurgitates it back to us in the same bitter language we use in our poetry when we're expounding on Dibki Lasomare. They speak to us in a dialect that teaches our children to fear their mother's tongue, as if it weren't a language that soothes the palate like a sweet welcoming of Lilo Beach, like a bitter taste after I read poems about tyrants trying to overtake Muqdisho, of my mother's childhood, of the way her hair would meet her tailbone, Gabar o Watan Khan Kuduntai, the way my mother's hair fell out at the border as if to almost say pieces of her fled from her in the same way she fled Kismayo. Nobody flees white sands and ocean air unless your children's survival precedes life. Okay, I'm gonna catch up on the chat as you reflect on that last poem. For me, this reminds me that through the turmoil of oppression, our soul calls us back to God through connection to the land. Beautiful. It resonates with me as it felt like he didn't belong, a similar feeling to immigrants, second generation kids, as we feel too Western for our country, but too ethnic for the West. Yes, beautiful, thank you. We haven't even gone to the writing prompt yet, amazing. Okay, so as you reflect on all these poems, I mean, I feel like the similarities are there, but they're also like very distinct narratives. I want you to think about the following, and then I'll share the prompt with you. So I want you to consider how each of the poets explore their relationship to the land, and how those relationships are rooted in either directly address colonization or just exist in a colonial context and are informed by colonization. I want you to think about the similarities that exist between each of the stories. And I want you to think about how displacement takes form in each of these poems. I think what's really interesting about the poems is, and I don't mean to bias you, but for me, I think what's really interesting is they talk about displacement from land, but also from self. And that is really interesting. So just think about that as you're thinking about the writing prompt. And I also want to say that although this is a poetry workshop, the intention is for you to express yourself in the way that feels comfortable. So if you want to write bullet points, if you want to write a poem, if you want to write a story, all of those are totally welcome. So the prompt is this: what is your relationship to the land? And for those of us that are settlers, I want us to also think about how we came to exist here. What did you or those who came before you leave behind? And how do we take up space here? I'm also going to drop the prompt in the chat, and then I'm going to give you 5 minutes to just sort of do quiet work, and we'll come back and inshallah we'll do some sharing. Are there any questions before we go into writing mode? Okay. Okay. I sort of lost track of time a little bit, so I'm not sure how long we've been gone, but hopefully that was enough time to at least begin to reflect and begin to put something down on paper. So I'm going to invite you to slowly come back, let me know that you're here, and I also want to invite you to share anything that you began to work through. You're welcome to raise your hand, or you can also share in the chat. Okay. I see some really beautiful poems actually in the chat. Does anyone share it with the group themselves?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Greetings to everyone. I am writing to you from Johannesburg in South Africa. So yeah, I just thought that, so this is actually a poem that I'd written a little while ago, but I felt that it resonated with the themes that we were exploring. So yeah, basically I said, I'll make it my mission to strengthen the shoulders on which our children will stand, to stay true to the land, to do the best that I can to lend a helping hand, to be a better man, to see the borderlands as no more than a line in the sand, to hold on to hope like it's contraband. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, hopefully that inspires some more sharing. But as we wait, I'm going to read some of the reflections in the chat. Coming from having a background from South Asia, I resonate with the indentured labor sector as it has personally affected me. However, as my family was taken by the British to a new land of false promises, my ancestral family had to connect with a new land and make it their home. How did they do that? They honored it, they protected it, they didn't usurp resources, they nurtured and planted and shared. I can honor them by doing the same with the land that I was born in and the only land that has really ever felt like home for me. I also just want to say, like, the beautiful metaphor of nurturing and planting and sharing and what that looks like in just so many expansive ways. Yeah, thank you so much, Amina. I thank you, Shadab, as well. I'm going to move on for now, but if at any point you feel compelled to share, please do that. Okay, so now that we've kind of reflected a little bit about what does displacement look like and how do we relate to this land, I want to move towards the idea of reconciliation, but do so acknowledging that this is very much just a starting point. Something really interesting that I got to do over the course of Ramadan was begin to invite people to think about how we can write land acknowledgements in the form of prayers and how we could draw on the Muslim tradition of making dua in order to do that. So before we jump into writing du'as, I want us just to think about and recall and reflect the prayers that are most familiar to us. So these can be the prayers that we say before we eat, that we begin our day with, that ground us, that help us to act and move with intention. So you can either write it down or take a moment to share it with us or recite it to yourself. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about the prayers, and then I'm going to invite you to share them with us. Okay, as you are remembering or busily typing in the chat, trying to transliterate, I'll share with you very quickly a prayer that for me is something that I revisit really often, especially as someone who tries to do storytelling and share poetry, is the prayer of Prophet Musa, where, yeah, he's just sort of calling on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help him and make his speech flow a little bit more easily. And he says, "Rabbi yashrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli." I'm so sorry I didn't prepare a translation, but hopefully that's familiar dua for you. And I think what's really important about the Muslim tradition of dua is it teaches us a couple of things, and there are some reflections that I draw on from it. For me, I think about how dua is sort of a reminder that our speech and our words have power, they hold power, because when we invoke prayer, there's this belief that what we're asking for will come true in some form or another. I also think that it calls on us to sort of think about what accountability looks like, because in the same way that you're, having belief in your words when you pray, you also act and you follow up the belief and the intention with action. So there's sort of this lesson of accountability. And I think the final thing is sort of the duality between hope and gratitude. You can be present and you can be thankful for what you have, but you can also hope for betterment and for improvement. And I think that those are all lessons that we can carry with us when we think about land and we reflect upon how we relate to land. So this next activity hopefully is not anything that's intimidating, because like I said, dua is a familiar part of our day-to-day existence and how we navigate the world around us. We've already begun to sort of conceptualize how you relate to land, but this time I want us to revisit the question, what is your relationship to the land, but center that answer in how we can honor this land and the first peoples of the land. So my challenge for you is to write a land acknowledgement in the form of a dua, and do so in a way that just feels familiar and sincere and honest for you. And I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll come back and we'll do some sharing. Okay, so we've taken a few minutes. Hopefully I'm not cutting you off mid-sentence as you're writing, but I hope that you've at least had the chance to begin to write something. I want to invite you to share again, and as you do that, I'm going to read some of the du'as in the chat and also some of the du'as that I've been collecting from community over the past few months. So Wati writes, "This land is not mine to own. I'm a fleeting, ephemeral being, carefully treading on bloodied soil, weaving memories with those who are hers." Beautiful. Joanna, do you feel comfortable sharing the dua that you wrote?
Sorry, did you say Jabala?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay. Just the last one I wrote was, Ya Rab, teach me the universal language. Help me recall the original ways in which we must walk. Ya Rab, I love you and you love me. Show us once again how to love one another. May we be united through divine purpose. Ameen.
Ameen. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to give you all a few more minutes to share as I read some of the other submissions that I've received over the past while. I hope for just reconciliation, for us to act collaboratively as faithful stewards of the land, for our work, our collaboration to be pleasing to the Creator. I pray for renewal like the thawing snow, the budding leaves, and the breaking sky. I pray that we can begin to learn again and we find a path forward. I pray for autonomy, to recognize the first peoples of this land who have gathered here for centuries. May we also act as we learn to care and pray for this land and for one another. Okay. All right, we're going to close this section, but I hope that you can carry this with you as you continue to make land acknowledgements in the future, inshallah, and also as you continue to make dua. So the final activity is a little bit, it's a little bit weird, I'll be honest, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I think that when we're talking about oppressive structures and undoing oppressive structures, for me, futurism is a medium or an art form that I'm really, really drawn to and that I want to share with all of you today. So the final section is rooted in how we can reimagine and how we can begin to do the work of healing, specifically because I think for me, when I come to this topic, I think about how as a Black woman, Afrofuturism is very, very powerful and important when I am navigating and having conversations about oppression and how we can move forward from oppression. When we think about reconciliation and justice, it's really important to conceptualize the futures that we're actually working towards. What are we fighting for? What are we trying to build? And I think that art in many ways can act as a tool for reimagining and for healing. So I want to talk to you a little bit about futurism, Indigenous futurism and Muslim futurism, the parallels, and then I'm going to call on you to write art or poetry that is rooted in that tradition. Okay. So first off, Indigenous futurism. The term Indigenous futurism was actually coined by Dr. Grace Dillon in 2003, and she wrote a book called Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. For her, Indigenous futurism is a movement that spans music, film, visual art, and pop culture, and it sort of imagines a world where colonization did not disrupt the civilization of Indigenous peoples. In the activity guide, you see at the bottom a painting called Our Grandmothers Carry Water from the Other World, and that is kind of a quintessential futurist work of art because it places these really familiar images in a scene that is like from a science fiction movie. It's completely unfamiliar. So you see these two grandmothers carrying water, but they're also in outer space, and it's sort of revolutionary by nature because it's challenging how we understand or visualize or see communities of color. I also want to talk to you about Muslim futurism. There is a collective that Aslam actually introduced me to called Al-Hamzu, and this is an arts collective that uses visual art, film, poetry, and music to sort of, again, challenge narratives around how we understand and see Muslims. And they write the following. The chronic suffering of yesterday and the compounded acute traumas of each day are constant affronts to the Muslim spirit, restricting us from conceiving and building towards a utopia of our own. May the process of boldly asserting our existence disrupt the hegemonic powers of today and serve as a portal to another planet where our joy is championed, our spirits are revitalized, and our commitments to flourishing and justice are re-energized. And in the chat, you could also see the link to the website. And I really invite you to visit and just look at the images because it'll help you to understand further what I'm talking about here. So as we think about futurism, and now we've kind of been able to ground it in definitions, I want us to take a look at the work of art at the bottom of the activity guide. And as we're looking at this piece and we're thinking about what it looks like to tell stories that decenter white supremacy and oppression and recenter our humanity and our dignity and who we are beyond oppression or colonization. Thank you. I have this writing prompt for you. Imagine that we're in a time beyond this place. What are the names for this new world? And by extension, what are the antidotes to the oppressive structures of our current reality? We're going to take 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene and share, inshallah. Okay, so I'm going to call you back. Hopefully you've had some time to reflect, think about what is the antithesis or the antidote to oppression, and how can that guide us to working to undo oppression and colonization. It might be a daunting task to try to do that work of imagining, but I think it's really valuable as we try to ground ourselves in reminders, because sometimes the work of working to undo oppression can be tiring. So remembering what you're working towards is, yeah, it's vital. I feel like everyone's busy in the middle of writing like these eloquent stanzas, and you're just not quite ready to share it just yet. But I invite you to share even the unfinished work. It's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you haven't had the chance yet to write anything, when you think about the idea of futurism in the context of decolonizing, what are like your initial impressions or thoughts? How is this changing your frame of reference when you're entering conversations like this?
And like I've thought about this before, and just the idea that like my children or grandchildren or great grandchildren like don't have to live in like the city of Vancouver, don't have to live according to like colonial laws and borders and ways of being, but might live on Musqueam or Squamish or Tsleil-Waututh. So there's like multiple ways of being that coexist, that are respected, that have different laws and governance. But more importantly, I think it's like that multiple ways of being are respected, and people have more choice. At the moment, I feel like our choice is white supremacy or death, and that doesn't feel like much of a choice, right? So how do we just like create more space for choice and agency?
Yeah, I think a big part of what futurism does is it just asks us to question what is natural. Like there's a lot of I guess conditions that exist within society that we kind of accept because we're used to them, but when we begin to question which of these conditions needs to exist and which of these conditions can we undo, I think it's really, really powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, I think we'll leave the discussion there. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts that are circling, but maybe this can just kind of be a starting point for conversations around futurism. The last thing that I'm going to leave you with is that I am working on creating a collection of dua books along with Ahmed and the rest of the team. Sorry, a collection of duas that are land acknowledgements. So if you feel called to share any of the things that you wrote today or want to submit and be included in that book, then I would love to receive any of the things that you've been working on. And you can feel free to shoot me an email and yeah, learn a little bit more about that project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Timiro. Will you share your email address in the chat box, and I'll also try to send it out to folks. It felt like such a small taster. Every time you gave us some time, I was like just getting a thought. So thank you for providing those notes as well that we can look back on and spend our own time in reflection. And I'm sure there'll be lots of, like the idea of a land acknowledgement to our book is just blowing my mind. I think it's absolutely incredible. So thank you for doing that as well.